if we were to see an outright dumping globally, like in Operation Sandman, as Mike Adams talks about, it would be chaotic because the natural reaction of the dollar creating hyperinflation being dumped across the globe, hitting our shores in a tsunami of inflation, would be a massive spike in interest rates. The dollar would collapse. The stock market would collapse. The bond market would collapse. Banking system would collapse. The insurance companies would collapse. Everything. This is the Great Reset.
For years, there have been whispers about Project Sandman, an alleged plan by a group of 100 countries to collapse the US economy and end the country's dominance over the rest of the world by simultaneously dumping all their US dollar holdings. As the world's reserve currency, the US dollar is the most commonly held reserve currency and the most widely used currency for international trade and other transactions worldwide. Being the issuer of a dominant global currency comes with several benefits, including ample demand for US debt instruments, which provide stability for businesses and consumers to thrive and prosper. The US dollar was backed by the world's largest gold reserves through the Bretton Woods Agreement to secure its position as the world's reserve currency. Then, later, the Petrodollar Agreement with Saudi Arabia. Both of these agreements have now been lost, and the dollar is like every other fiat currency, backed by nothing but massive debts and the promise of more reckless spending and borrowing from unborn generations. This is why experts like renowned bullion dealer and financial commentator Andy Schechtman believe we are nearly upon an all-at-once moment that will see countries and foreign investors dump dollars on US investors in droves, which will have an instant and devastating effect on the economy. The situation is worsened by the current state of the US economy. The United States is the world's largest economy and is the issuer of the world's reserve currency, but it is easily comparable to another banana republic when you look at its massive debts. The United States has accumulated a national debt of $34.840 trillion. That is almost $2 trillion in debt accumulated since September 2023, when we hit $33 trillion for the first time in US history. This does not even account for the equally massive off-balance sheet debts. Andy explains that the world sees the current state of the US economy as an opportunity to escape the oppressive and hypocritical rule of the West. This is why international alliances and organizations like BRICS, OPEC, Shanghai Corporation, and others are making obvious moves to reduce their dependence on the dollar. According to Andy, we are moving from a dollar-dominated global financial and economic system to a more stable system backed by gold and other commodities, a shift that he predicts will have an instantaneous and beneficial impact on gold and silver prices. As we present clips from Andy's recent interview with Kitco News, please take a little time to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications for more videos like this. Thanks, and enjoy the video.
Yeah, so every country on the planet's had to stockpile dollars for the last 50 years in order to buy oil. The significance of that is extraordinary, almost as extraordinary as taking the reserves, the excess, and putting it into treasuries, which is the reserve status of the dollar. The settlement status of the dollar, where every country needed to own it and stockpile it in order to buy oil, is certainly being challenged by all of these deals that are being done bilaterally, where countries will trade with one another in local currencies. And this is a huge deal. In other words, what is the incentive of countries to hold our dollars, which are being inflated away at a rate of $1 trillion in debt every single 100 days? What used to take 200 years to accumulate $1 trillion, now we're doing it in 100 days. And a government that has chosen weaponization of the treasury and the dollar if we don't align ideologically. So the incentive of these countries who have been forced into holding dollars and stockpiling them, creating a synthetic demand, you could argue is no longer in place. Now, how fast does this unwind is the big question. But yeah, it's very, very, very significant. The reason the dollar was called the petrodollar, the reason that it had such great privilege and the hegemony, if you will, was created because everyone had to own it in order to buy oil. And oil makes the world go round. You take that away, and what is behind the dollar, it becomes truly fiat, backed by nothing whatsoever. But as Putin has recently said in a conference, the confidence of the United States economy, and I have to add to that the confidence of the United States government. And you ask yourself, is that waning? I'll leave that up to people to decide. I'm sure we'll talk about that as this interview goes on. As those dollars, there are way more dollars outside the U.S. than are inside the U.S. because of the stockpiling to buy oil for 50 years. And as those dollars come home and are sold back to the issuer, because no one wants to hold them anymore. Now, it hasn't turned out into a full-fledged dumping, which I could see it turning into that at some point. But there still is demand for the dollar. As you mentioned, it still does represent 58% of global reserves. And there is dollar-denominated debt that needs to be paid off. But little by little by little, I call it logarithmic decay. Little by little by little by little, it starts to chip away as those dollars are there's no longer a necessity to hold them. And as those dollars start to come home, inflation rates would go higher and higher and higher and higher. And heaven forbid it's a dumping. There's something out there called Project Sandman that basically says there's a whole group of 150, 175 countries that have agreed to do just that, to dump dollars and treasuries at a predetermined time. The question is it orderly or is it chaotic? But as those dollars come home, the level of inflation rises as those currency units are added to the currency base here, which would then raise interest rates. And that's the big thing that I've always talked about, is that Powell doesn't want to raise rates, doesn't want to let the 10-year treasury get above 5% because of the over-leveraged system, in particular the banks and the broker or the insurance companies that are massively over-leveraged and undercapitalized. And as rates rise, and supposedly this magic number is at 5% on the 10-year treasury, things start to break. Now, if all of a sudden the world is no longer holding dollars and in fact forsaking and dumping them and throwing them back to the issuer, creating much, much higher inflation than the CPI would probably tell us, the market would demand a higher interest rate to compensate for that loss of purchasing power. You can't have double-digit inflation and single-digit interest rates. Your currency dies. So interest rates would rise to meet that loss in purchasing power, to compensate for that. And when that happens, that's when you start to get into problems.
Periods of high interest rates have always been accompanied by severe economic challenges, especially for businesses and investors. This is why Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell warned Americans to prepare for hard times when the central bank started raising rates in 2022. According to S&P Global Market Intelligence, 637 bankruptcy filings were recorded in 2023. 265 filings higher than the previous year, and just one lower than the 638 bankruptcy filings recorded in 2020. 275 bankruptcy filings have been recorded in 2024, just two fewer than were recorded during the same period in 2023. But if Andy's warnings and predictions are accurate, what's coming will be much worse. In his words, it starts off slow because the players that are in the know don't want to cut off their noses to spite their face, so it starts with little by little by little, de-dollarization, dumping of treasuries, replacing treasuries with gold. Then the all-at-once moment happens, and chaos reigns. According to Andy, this all-at-once moment will result in extreme economic conditions, hyperinflation, a massive spike in interest rates, a high unemployment rate, stagflation, and the eventual collapse of the bond and stock markets and the banking system. Andy terms this the Great Reset.
A lot of people who push back against this thesis say, well, the BRICS don't have a bond market and the bond market is still the most liquid, and where do you put your reserves? Well, I'll tell you where you put your reserves. First and foremost, they have been putting them into gold. And if you go back 25 years, gold has doubled the performance of the bond market. It's averaged 9.9% compounding per year for the last 25 years. But what it doesn't have is counterparty risk. So when you look at all of these bilateral agreements, if we go back to the meeting in South Africa last year, that was the plan. That was, go back to the drawing board. We still need to talk about how we reach a common settlement currency. And I want to talk about that for a moment because James Rickards has a very interesting take on that, and I agree with it. But in the meantime, let's all trade in local currencies where, China just canceled big orders for grain from Australia and the United States, replacing it with orders from Brazil, the second largest producer or exporter of corn in the world and a big a grain producer. And they will take yuan for the payment, not in dollars. That chips away at the dollar settlement. And then the reserves would then be put into gold instead of U.S. treasuries, which have a better track record and have no counterparty liability. But this is being seen everywhere, whether it be between Iran and China, or as you mentioned earlier, between China and the United Arab Emirates, or between Russia and India. All these countries are trading in local currencies. That chips away at the dollar settlement status. The reserve status gets chipped away when we see these countries shedding treasuries, like we've seen. China's down to just over 700 billion in treasuries from almost 3 trillion, and their gold holdings have increased, other than this month, which has remained stagnant for 19 straight months in a row. That's indicative of all of these countries in the Southern Hemisphere. They are slowly and methodically detreasurizing and accumulating gold and foreign or commodities in replacement. And I really do believe that these commodities, as Zoltan Pozsar calls Bretton Woods III, a system backed by commodities, have become more valuable than the currencies that they're being bought with. And so the lack of treasury settlement is really the key. And I think this is the one thing that the people who, the dollar bulls and the recency bias, normalcy bias people are missing. And yes, there isn't something like the bond market yet, but I think gold represents not only, think about it, treasuries represent but a very small sliver of history in terms of other countries accepting a country's debt as an asset. But gold has a 5,000-year history of that, as do all of these commodities. There's an old saying, he who has the commodity, or the gold rather, makes the rules. And this flow of commodities, in particular gold and silver, from the west to the east is being massively underestimated. And I think that underestimation of the significance of that is a very, very big Achilles heel. This is something where these countries, I believe, are looking to commodities to replace, in particular gold, which is the only other tier 1 reserve asset, as mandated by the BIS in 2019. Look at the massive accumulation of gold by all of these Southern Hemisphere countries and the slow de-dollarization and de-treasurization. They are trading treasuries in dollars for commodities that cannot be weaponized or inflated away. And that's really, gold is the issue here, and it's being overlooked.
It's now a matter of when, not if, the all-at-once moment happens. When it finally does, tangible assets like gold and silver will find their true value, while stock and bond investors will have a difficult time of it all. This is precisely why people like Andy have been urging investors to see gold and silver as wealth, especially as they are the only assets that are at the same time not someone else's liabilities. Gold and silver are wealth, and when shit truly hits the fan, everyone will quickly realize how valuable they are. Please comment below on Andy's interview and his gloomy predictions for the US economy and the dollar. Also, ensure you smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications bell for more videos on gold, silver, and other metals and commodities. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.